I had a free day between lectures during my recent tour of Great Britain, and my hosts in Glasgow, Scotland, very generously took me on a tour of their art museum, the university in Glasgow, and the historical collection that's housed there. And later we drove a few minutes south of the city to visit the remains of Antonin's Wall, the farthest northern border of the former Roman Empire. The Romans, of course, wanted to rule the world, and they did a pretty good job of accomplishing that. They moved their boundaries from the Caspian Sea and the Euphrates in the east, all the way through Europe, through England, and right up to Scotland, where Emperor Hadrian decided that the Scots were just not worth the fight and built a wall to keep the barbarians north and the Roman Empire south of that. Antonin was a successor in the 2nd century, and emperors become famous by having expanded the empire, so he wanted to push beyond Hadrian's Wall. He went 100 miles north of Hadrian's Wall and built a earthen wall to expand the empire 4 days' march north of Hadrian's Wall. And it was successful for a very short period of time. The Scots simply refused to be occupied, and the Romans were, in a few years, beaten back to their previous line at the Hadrian's Wall. But much of what the Romans left behind is on display in the History Museum on the campus of the University of Glasgow. Now, for contrast, I just want to remind you that 100 years ago in Springfield, people in our area largely heated their homes by burning firewood in their fireplace. They went out to a well or a spring and carried water in buckets back into their house, and they had an outhouse in their backyard, or, as in my family's case in Kentucky, an outhouse in the front yard. I don't know who made that decision. That stood over a hole they dug in the ground. But nearly 2,000 years ago, the Romans had paved roads, sewers, aqueducts, and they heated their homes against the cruel Scottish winters with under-the-floor radiant heat from hot air piped underneath the floors of their houses. Samples of their household items, along with their art, architectural facades, and armament, were very impressive. I have the feeling that if the Romans had been able to harness electricity and to develop an internal combustion engine, that they not only would have conquered Scotland, but we might very well be speaking Latin right now. Veni, vidi, vici, as it were. The culture that produced our New Testament was primitive in many areas of what is to us commonly understood science. But in many respects of philosophy and art, they may be way ahead of us. They were giving birth to Western civilization in the 1st century of the Common Era, battling the violent, ignorant, and dark aspects of humanity. Of course, during my rather occasional access to the news while I was watching from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, I realized that our civilization is also struggling to overcome some of the violent and dark aspects of civilization. 47 American senators sent a letter to the government of Iran to scuttle treaty negotiations aimed at preventing Iran from becoming a nuclear power. 47 people that tried to explain how our constitutional government works to Iranian mullahs, and they got it wrong. I mean, they truly were mistaken in their interpretation of our own Constitution. The Prime Minister from Israel spoke to Congress while I was away, basically encouraging us to start a war with Iran because, he says, if we check Iran, that would stabilize the Middle East. Now, I want to remind you that Netanyahu visited and spoke to Congress in 2002, assuring our Congress at that time that if only we would take out Saddam Hussein, that would stabilize the Middle East. And yet, Netanyahu got a standing ovation longer than any other visiting head of state in modern history in our Congress, as if this guy was a reliable source of information. All the while, our politicians and media keep up the drumbeat to make ISIS the rock stars of terrorism, because of their horrifying practices, admittedly horrifying practices in warfare, including beheadings. But still, our government and most of our media is entirely silent about the fact that ISIS couldn't hold a candle to Saudi Arabia's practice of publicly beheading 50 to 100 people a year for years, for decades, while taking huge amounts of American donations from taxpayers. Meanwhile, our elite Secret Service, charged with protecting our first family, was found once again to be driving drunk on the lawn of the White House in the wake of having allowed intruders to scale the fence and run and gain access to the White House. Bill Maher suggested if they're going to drive drunk on the White House lawn, they should at least try to hit one of the intruders that's climbing over the fence. And that on the heels of having been found drunk in the hallways of foreign hotels after the prostitutes they had hired had locked them out of their rooms. At some point, there should be some embarrassment about lack of civilization here. But, and you hear about this in England as well, just across the state line to the west of us, young white college students raised in privilege yet still afraid of their dark-skinned neighbors who have never had the opportunity to taste opportunity, sing racist songs to bolster their courage to defend a segregated social life against any form of decency or reason. And of course, here at home, we've been racing back towards the Dark Ages. I moved here 25 years ago, and we had an abortion clinic in Springfield at that time. We at least acknowledged a woman's right to make a decision in the city where she lived. And now in Missouri, we have one abortion provider in the entire state, and that's in St. Louis. People have to drive for hours, and then they have to make 2 visits. I think there's a 72-hour enforced wait in the state of Missouri, that we are racing backwards away from civil rights in our own state, living here in a city that does not allow women to manage their own reproductive lives, maintaining enforced poverty and low wages, restricting access to health care. And 9 days from today, we'll get to go to the polls to see if our neighbors are willing to repeal the civil rights extended to gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and the trans community. We have the most advanced technology in the history of the world, but our civilization has not kept up with the progress we've made in medicine, physics, engineering. In many ways, it seems that our advanced communication techniques and our superior college and university systems have made us less informed rather than more informed, and have corrupted our ability to deliberate moral decision-making. So when we read the New Testament in 2015, even though I've often reminded you that the Bible was written by people who did not know where the sun goes at night, an objective review of our current news situation might lead you to the conclusion that our current civilization doesn't know how to tell its left hand from its right. So the passage before us is very familiar. Even if you've only watched wrestling and baseball games, you know John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son so that whoever believes in him could live forever. And yet if you read on, the author further illuminates his views, which, if read in context, I would insist that he is saying is a corrective of some of the more moralizing and threatening aspects of the letters of Paul in the New Testament. He says that Jesus did not come to condemn, but to save, as an expression of the love of God. Now, when I was younger, we used to study the Bible, and I'll say I've spent a lot of years in college and a lot of my life studying Scripture, but for most of that time, we were trying to figure out how to reconcile the Bible to itself, how to make sure that there's only one message in the Bible. It agrees with itself, so we've got to figure out how to interpret it so that it all is saying the same thing. But in later years, we've come to the realization that the Bible is actually a public debate, that an awful lot of what's written in Scripture was written to correct other parts of Scripture, that there are authors who are trying very hard to say, no, not that, but this. One of Marcus Borg's last book projects before his death was to print the New Testament in the order in which it was written, so that if you read it in order, you can see how Christian faith evolved in the latter half of the first century and the early part of the second century. And as in most evolutions, the evolution wasn't always for the better. But in this beautiful and much loved passage from the last of the canonical Gospels, John, the author seems to be throwing reassurances our way. Don't be afraid of what Paul said. God is not hostile to you. God is not eager to judge you. God does not view us as that great American revivalist preacher Jonathan Edwards was famous for saying, "Thy God doth despise thee as a man who holds a spider over a flame." John is saying, in fact, God does not despise you, but loves you, and sent Jesus to us to communicate that love. But again, if you keep reading, John is still willing to draw a very disturbing line in the sand. Jesus didn't come to condemn if you're on the right side of the line. Verse 18 says, "Those who believe in him are not condemned, but those who do not believe are condemned already, because they have not believed in the name of God's only Son." So you think we're progressing towards a religion of love and away from all of the fear, guilt, and judgment, and then you see that he's still willing to build Hadrian's Wall and say, decent folk over here, barbarians over there, and the Scots have to stay north of the border. Now, I absolutely reject John's exclusivism in suggesting that Jesus was a talisman that you hang around your neck to keep God from hating you. What I've been trying to say to you for years, and I sincerely apologize for how often I've said it very indelicately, as if you had to be jarred into rethinking these issues. But we do not despise the Bible because of its cultural blinders. We can love it because it also contains great cultural insights. But we can debate it. It's not a hate it or love it. You can love it for what it's got that's insightful, but you can debate with it just like it debates itself. You have to recognize that the authors, particularly of the New Testament, did not agree with each other. The only reason there's 4 Gospels is because the guys that wrote the last 3 didn't like the others. They were trying to correct them. So John is talking about love in the midst of a violent empire. We can applaud that. He didn't get it all right. He wasn't entirely consistent with what he had to say about love and inclusion and suspending prejudice. But who on earth should understand that better than we do? I mean, not getting it all right, we've been right there for 2 centuries. John was trying to set aside a religion of obligation, of piety, fear, and exclusion, and he wasn't able to get it done all at once. I see myself there. It has not been a straight line for me from my rural Kentucky evangelical faith to a more open and loving progressive approach. And I still have some prejudices and demons that need to be sorted out, because these things don't go away all at once. They don't go away easily. John tried to project his insights onto the blank screen of a supernatural theistic God in the heavens, who he says loves us. I'm convinced that all that talk about God who is up there or out there is a fundamental failure to acknowledge that what can be known of God, whatever we can ever know of God, we will know within the community. You either find God within the community, or you're really just kind of whistling in the graveyard. It's not that a heavenly God has decided to forego judgment and warfare against us and to love us in spite of ourselves. The harder reality is that we have to forego judgment and warfare against one another and to love each other, even the ones who don't deserve it. Not just the ones who block your path in the grocery store aisles or who take up 2 parking places with their overpriced car at the mall. We have to love Muslims. We have to love the peaceful ones and the ones that are acting really crazy right now. We have to love immigrants, the ones that came here 200 years ago and the ones that just got here last week. We need even to love the people who are going to vote against civil rights for our gay brothers and sisters, and for fraternity brothers who are keeping alive racist sentiments that were born in the shadow of the Civil War and have never been entirely rooted out. White college students don't hate black college students. White college students are afraid of black college students. And because they are afraid, they do things that perpetuate the reason why they ought to be afraid. Christians don't hate Muslims. It's just that many Christians have been taught to be afraid of Muslims. And our 100-year history of bombing Muslims perpetuates the very real reasons why we should be afraid. Republicans and Democrats don't hate each other indigenously. They fear losing power, from being removed from a position of privilege and advantage. And clearly, their partisan bickering is making their reason for fear quite real. Now, John tries to make it sound noble. God knew that we are crazy, violent, greedy, partisan, racist, homophobic, and dishonest, but God loved us anyway and was willing to sacrifice for us to give us a chance to change. What we need to say is that we recognize that we've been lied to, lied about, disappointed, rejected, victimized, been made to feel simultaneously angry and afraid. And while part of us wants to ignore the world as if turning off the news makes it all go away, we still kind of want revenge first. But we've decided instead to love, and to love in a way that will require some personal sacrifice, that will require forgiving people who are guilty, that will require putting some of our own flesh on the line as we try to bring healing to a violent world. If it was possible to bomb terrorists, imprison criminals, and undermine political adversaries so that the whole world could be prosperous and peaceful, I would be in favor of that agenda. But we've tried it, and it doesn't work. John says the way is through suspending judgment, not condemning, and to love sacrificially, and that, I think, we have not yet tried. But I think it would work.
Amen.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Rev. Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.